Now that we discussed social construction and how it relates to race, amongst other things, like we noted, nations, gender, and other things you could include in there, we're going to take this concept of race as social construction and link it or connect it to Asian exclusion in dominant society, dominant culture. But before we do that, we need to remind ourselves the underlying and fundamental assumption as to why it was felt Asians should not belong to the United States, whether through naturalization or citizenship, should be excluded from immigration laws like the 1882 Exclusion Act and others. And this leads us to that perennial theme in this course that should be readily apparent to you now, right? This idea of Asians being perpetual foreigners, quote unquote, right? That they're strangers, foreigners, and we have to ask ourselves, or at least remind ourselves, since we already introduced this in the class, remind ourselves why this is the case. Why are Asians, arguably even today, in some cases, though much less so than, let's say, 100 years ago, or more than that? Why is it the case that Asians are constantly misconceived, misunderstood as being foreigners? And again, this connects to Orientalism as an ideology. As we acknowledged, and this is all review, this arose during the age of European imperialism. It was a way for the European imperialists, and certainly American too, right, to make sense of races they were newly encountering. And this is their classification system, right? They based it on skin color. Previous, it was, or the encounter with the other. Sure, there was differentiation made upon skin color, but also other things, right? Race was not what everyone was focused upon, let alone obsessed with. Okay, so again, the presupposition with Orientalism is that the world is divided into two fundamental parts. These parts are opposed to each other. They form binary opposites, to use a term. They're fundamentally opposed, so the two cannot meet, okay, because they are so different from each other. And the corollary to that, right, the logical extension of that is that you cannot take a person of Oriental descent and place that person in the Occidental world and expect him or her to become westernized, right? To assimilate, in other words, to the Occidental or the Western world. And it goes the opposite way too. You can't take, according to Orientalism, you cannot take a person from the Occidental world and place them in the Oriental world and expect them to assimilate, expect them to become, Orientalized, if you will. So even though seems outlandish to us today, you could be assured that this was a prominent way of thinking about Asians and Orientals. And by the way, I mentioned this, that Orientals were not merely persons from, say, China, Japan, or the Philippines. It also applied to persons of Middle Eastern descent. Okay. In fact, the academic who is responsible almost single-handedly for introducing this idea of Orientalism uh, to the academic world, this happened in the 1980s, 1990s, was a Palestinian scholar named Edward Said, Said. He wrote a book called Orientalism, which basically showed how persons in the Middle East, how they were constructed and socially constructed, choose a term, by the Western powers when they went to colonize that part of the world. So ultimately, what we're talking about is that Asians seen as unassimilable, they cannot fully assimilate in the Occidental imagination. Therefore, they're seen as fundamentally opposed, or to use our term, the binary opposites of the Westerner, of the Western world, and in this case of America, at least during the 19th century and early 20th century. And I have to say that, this is based on exterior qualities. We could even use the genetic word phenotype, right? What one looks like. By outward appearances, we're talking about the shape or the contour of the eyes, the texture of the hair, even stature. And then you combine those physical qualities, exterior qualities, with certain culturally determined behavior, even the language, right? And the overall result of this is that they're so foreign and so different that they cannot belong in the nation because they just can't assimilate. And I also have to mention that today it's hard for us to imagine this, especially when you live in a big metropolitan city like San Diego, like Los Angeles, like San Francisco, like New York, especially. But you got to remember the world was so different. So it was much easier for people to take this for granted. That is to say, Orientalism and Asians as being perpetual foreigners. But I will say, in some parts of the world, or even our country, where there's much less of an immigrant Asian population, there's still that assumption that they're foreigners. Okay, that if you go to some parts of the world, and I know this through experience, so do other family members and friends, that if you go to some parts of the country, certain states, small towns, that they'll assume you're a foreigner, and they'll even say things like, "Well, you speak really good English," things like that. Assuming that you weren't born here and you just came as an immigrant, therefore you're kind of a foreigner, right? Okay, but again, this was the prevalent belief back in the day, so to speak. Now, what does all this discussion have to do with the law and Asian America? And, this is a slide I had earlier. As we noted in Asian American history, the law is a central mechanism of Asian exclusion. And there's two primary ways this is done, okay, as noted on here. The first is the use of the law as related to race and nationality. Okay. And then when we look at this first function of the law as related to race and nationality, it really falls under two types of laws: naturalization and citizenship, and of course, immigration laws. Now, they're closely related, but obviously, there's still a distinction. You're talking about citizenship or national belonging in one sense, and the other one is immigration, who you're allowing into the country, right? And we'll discuss these laws in a bit, but the second way that this pertains to Asian American history, and we see it as a central mechanism of exclusion, is that the law, as we noticed at the beginning of this topic, the law is used to, quote, construct race. Okay, it serves a purpose in creating different races, and this is at an administrative level and a legal level, right? Such as the census, the U.S. Census that we do every 10 years. The law creates different races in U.S. history, and if we look at the history of racial classifications in our history, right, we see there's so much variation. And why is there so much variation? If race is seen as something that's natural, why can't it be determined, definitionally, legally, sociologically, whatever? Why can't it be determined with exact precision, right? Precisely. Well, that's because it's always changing because we invent it. Okay. Now, the first thing we're going to do is talk about number one: the use of the law is related to race and nationality. All right. So, with this slide before you, you see naturalization and citizenship laws and how it's related to race. That first line says the history of racial prerequisites for naturalization and citizenship. Okay, in other words, When did race, or when was race, a condition, a necessary condition to determine who could be naturalized as a citizen of the United States? Well, there's two phases to this history. The first phase spans from 1790 to 1870, and we'll see how between 1870 and the 20th century, 1952 and 1965. I know this sounds or looks weird because there's two different years here, but they're actually connected in terms of immigration laws. So this phase will be marked with really the most involvement of Asians and their attempt to contest things like, what is white, whether they should be aliens ineligible for citizenship, and so on and so forth. Now, the first phase begins in 1790, and you might notice that the Constitution that we have today, right, it's actually our second Constitution. We had a first one before that, before our current Constitution. But the Constitution we have today was ratified in 1789, and many modern scholars and historians believe really this is the real birth of the modern United States of America in 1789. So by 1789, 1790, you had legislators trying to determine who could become a citizen of this new nation, who could be naturalized. And they came up with the 1790 Naturalization Act. And the two conditions at this point, in the beginning of our history, were number one, had to be free, couldn't be a slave, in other words. And number two, you had to be white. Now, what was white in 1790 is so different than it is today, okay? Let alone 100 years from 1790 and 1890, okay? So, again, this points towards how it's going to be legally constructed through the decades following 1790. But nonetheless, those were the two conditions, white and being free, all right? Now, this brings up a distinction here in the history of naturalization and citizenship. These are two Latin terms as related to the law. Okay, they're known as jus sanguinis, and this is contrasted with jus soli. Okay, now jus sanguinis is basically this: when citizenship is conferred due to the status of your parents. So, in other words, if your parents are of American citizenship, then you are too. You automatically inherit citizenship upon birth. All right. Sanguinis, the Latin root here is blood. Okay, and by the way, this points towards this idea of citizenship being connected to blood, right? As if, there's a biological component to it, interestingly enough. Now, jus soli is going to say this, that as opposed to being inherited through, your parents, well, citizenship is actually determined by where you're born, okay? And if you're born on U.S. soil, for example, then you are automatically a citizen. So obviously, the case will arrive whereby, or will emerge, whereby you have immigrants not born in the United States, but their children are born on U.S. soil. Therefore, they're automatically conferred with citizenship. So that's jus soli. So through this first phase, the 1790 Naturalization Act, through the 14th Amendment, which again followed the Civil War, which we discussed, whereby freed African slaves, or former African slaves that are now free, now had to be given citizenship rights, citizenship freedoms, but this was done through establishing the 14th Amendment based on what? It's based on jus soli, right? Since they're born on American soil, they get American citizenship. Obviously, most slaves at the time, their parents were not American citizens, right? They were slaves, so jus sanguinis cannot apply to them, right? So this marks a sea change, if you will, in the way citizenship is inherited or gained, right? We're going to see a switch, in other words, a transition from, or a shift from 1790 to 1870 being primarily jus sanguinis, right? to the second phase where it's a jus soli. Now, here's the thing though, and here's what complicates the picture. And this is why we needed to talk about Orientalism before we discuss this stuff. Again, just to repeat for who knows how many times I've already done so, um, since Asians were believed to be unassimilable due to Orientalism, that is to say, that they can't really belong, it was felt that jus soli could not be applied to them. Okay, so what you're going to see here are various cases that some of them are going to reach the highest court of the land, like Wong Kim Ark, Azawa, and the Thin case. Okay, there'll be Supreme Court cases whereby various Asians will challenge their exclusion from citizenship. Okay, and basically they're going to say that it comes down to racial discrimination, which is absolutely true, right? Orientalism and racial discrimination is exactly what's determining their exemption, them being barred from citizenship.